Welcome everyone to the second session of International Conference on Equitable Education Together Towards Equity for this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, for the next session, it will be held in the plenary format with the topic of effects from COVID-19 pandemic. And the moderator for this session, please join me in welcoming Dr. Arti Seiji, the Chief of Education, UNICEF Thailand, to be the moderator for this session, please.
Hello. Yes. Good morning, everybody. I'm Arti Seiji, and I am with UNICEF Thailand, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you on today's session on the effects of COVID-19 on the education systems. And I'm joined by three very distinguished experts from UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Bank. Please allow me to invite them to join me on the table. Let's, Nini from UNESCO. Mitsui from UNICEF East Asia and Regional Pacific Office. And Lars from World Bank. Thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about the panel before we dive deep into it. So we are looking, it's the first opening session, so it's a panel which is going to set the stage for the rest of the workshop, and it's primarily looking at the effects of COVID on education systems. What is the magnitude of the disruptions caused by school closures on key SDG 4 indicators? How does it compare to pre-pandemic estimates? What lies at the core of emerging narrative around learning loss and education recovery? How has learning loss exacerbated inequalities in education delivery and outcomes? What does this mean for human capital development across the life cycle of children and young people? How do you recover and get back on track? What policy options do you exercise to enable short-term education recovery and long-term education transformation? These are some of the questions that these three experts will attempt to answer and unpack during their presentations within the next hour. And this will be followed by a Q&A session where you, as in people in the room, the audience today, face-to-face, and those online, will get an opportunity to ask your questions and engage with the issue. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first expert, Mr. Nini Thong, Program Specialist from UNESCO, to provide us with a statistical overview of the effects of COVID-19 on access and enrollment in Asia Pacific. Nini, over to you.
Thank you, Ati, and good morning, everybody, and then also good afternoon probably from the Pacific, colleague joining online or in person also. Today, what I would like to present is about, as my colleague Ati mentioned, kind of orientation on the overview of the effect of COVID-19, particularly for access and enrollment in Asia and the Pacific, which I would like to do it. So here is, due to the short time, I'm not going to introduce myself. As Ati mentioned, my name is Nini Thong, and the Program Specialist Education Policy and Planning from UNESCO Bangkok Office. You can Google me and you will see all my story. So here's the one. Let me start with that in saying that, although this is a very fast presentation for this conference, and I would like to come up with a nice, encouraging view, but in reality, when we look at it, although I love to do that, you will see that, when we look at the achievement for particularly for enrollment and participation, I would say that, even before COVID, we are having a problem and issue for stagnating in our participation. When you look at them in the all cross level, the primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary, in this region across the sub-regional, we will see that even before pandemic, the challenge has been already over it's going through, and also that there's a stagnation mostly in the primary since 2014, and also lower secondary. I would see in upper secondary there's some kind of the improvement, but that's still a lot of struggle to go also. So you will see that. And then also here, even when we go down to the more detail, and allow me to talk for SDG 4 by target by target, you will see that also. Sorry. Even that we have a high access and participation, especially for primary and lower secondary in this region, with about the 90%. However, as I mentioned, progress has been stagnated. And then there's a greater challenge in making students complete at the cycle, especially in the upper secondary level. And then also, when we look at the completion rate, even our access for participation from 90% is go down to the 74%. And then half of the students do not even achieve. Then when we get to the learning achievement, which my colleague Mizu will elaborate more detail in her presentation, and then we do not achieve the even required minimum concept for reading and mathematics. So I would say that when we look through there will be, when we look at from the access and participation, traditionally our region has used to have a promising trend toward, but going towards that, moving forward from the completion toward the reading and learning achievement, I'm sorry to say that our region have all track for achieving SDG 4 particularly level also. So then there's a looking at the target 4.2. And then when we look at the target 4.2 for early childhood development and universal pre-primary education, I would see there's a little bit of promising news. I would say that many countries has given the priority for ECC in Asia and the Pacific. That result, the most progress in the participation rate, we have a pick at the one indicator for 1 year before the official primary effort. And I would say that there's a notable uptick in record in the many countries in the three region. So that's the good news. I would say that relatively, the very encouraging news. And in 50% of the country in this region, when you look at it, at least around more than 75% of the children are in the development on track also. So there is a kind of I would say the compounding effect, and the advocacy we have been made through all the last decade has been started to being result, and people have started to notice that. But just this morning I talked with my colleague there also, but there are a lot to be done, need to be done also. And then, but in general, I would say that most of the country, they are in the progress toward for making the progress in the SDG target 4.2 also. And then let's look at from the other target area, 4.3, equal access to the technical, vocational, and higher education. I would say that when you look at the slides and in the graph, TVET is always relatively neglected education path in many countries in this region with a very little participation. Despite, there's a need for the skill development being priority in the national economic development also. And then at the same time, enrollment in the tertiary at the university is high in the economy. Well, strong country as usual, but developing country, they also indicate 1 to 2 in the 5 U adult enroll in the university. And then let's look at from the gender equality and inclusion perspective. You will see that, also that we look at through the gender, location, whether different the inclusion perspective. I will say that in terms of gender, more girls than boys complete upper secondary education. That's a good news. And then less girls than boys are out of school in upper secondary level. So what is the message for the gender advocacy? Once the girls, they make it in the school, they do their best. So that is a good news for us. But at the same time, when you look at the other aspect or the location of where, as usual, I would say that even the compound, in the COVID, you will see that most of the disadvantaged group, youth, the marginalized group, they are the most affected and most the suffer, and the children particularly, as mentioned, the disability and ethnicity further exacerbate this disparity also. So, and then, so these are the things which are happening even in the pandemic. And when we look at what is the effect on the COVID disruption, you will see that almost all the children in this region, education, more than 800 million children across Asia has been disrupted in one way or other in the school. And then a lot, and half of them, 400 million in South Asia, and 260 million in the East Asia and 140 million Southeast Asia. Which is to say that, many of the children, almost all the children are one way or other affected by this pandemic also. And then also there are more than 27 million children waited to more than a year to return to school. So that's a huge learning loss, which again, also my colleague Mizu will elaborate also. And then also, along with that, also the 43 million teacher has been affected. So our education has been greatly disrupted in the physically or psychologically or emotionally as well. So what is the response for COVID-19? I would say that, many countries, as usual, we all expect, almost 2/3 of the country use online learning. One way or other, they have introduced it, and also many of the countries, and then 4 in 10 countries use the televised instruction, 1 in 4 countries use the radio broadcast. So their countries are trying to respond to the extent possible with their resource available, technology available, but question we have to ask is it systematically delivered? And then also you will see that, many countries face challenge in providing the access to remote learning at all, and preparing, particularly for the preparing for teacher to adopt the new way of teaching. So when we look at technically the human side, of course, technical, they are feasible to deliver the education and the approach and responding, but also the teacher readiness and also the strengthening the teacher capacity are becoming quite challenging for us. So you will see that because of this, although we try, our member states, our country are trying our best, there's risk of dropout. There are 6.7 million students in the region at the risk of dropping out of school, and also there's an estimated 4% increase in out-of-school children in the region also. And then there are great learning loss, and the 10% of point decline in children proficiency in the reading between 2000 and 2020 also. And then also, as a monitoring perspective, there are huge disruption in the data. So it's that particular period, we have also the globally more than 80% of lower middle income country, low income country are face moderate to severe education data disruption. So there are huge information gap also happening also. So I would say that what are the impact of COVID-19 education? I would say projected number of additional students competing education level without minimum proficiency in reading are huge a lot, which my colleague, the Mizu will further elaborate. But I would say that without then, the effective group will be the marginalized, and that need to be really further addressed. And then also, I would say that before I go to the last slides, when we look at the out-of-school children, change between 2021 and compared to 2019, when we see that we have a kind of the mixed result. Then the out-of-school children show mixed trend. Some countries, they have, with a weaker economy, tend to see higher out-of-school population in 2021 compared to 2019. But many countries also see fewer out-of-school children population than in COVID-19. Because maybe perhaps we need to look at more detail, because the out-of-school children has been this problem has been exit, but maybe because of our collective effort, paying the more attention to us for this, maybe indicate that many learners have indeed learning return to the school. Now our policy question will be that, okay, how can we further capture their learning loss, and how can we cater, and then also particularly most marginalized group, how should we address this also? So having this said, maybe I would like to conclude my presentation with the quoting a note from our champion, I would say Melinda Gates said, the pandemic has magnified every existing inequality in our society, like systemic racism, and gender inequality and poverty also. Now, how should we address? I would start recalling from our Director General from UNESCO. Never before have we witnessed educational disruption at that scale. But partnership is the way forward. So that's the way, the result. We came here to discuss for how do we address also. And then in that working together in the process, I would like to quote for the colleague from Clary Fiorona, from the former CEO for HP, the goal is to turn data into information and the information into insight. So which means we really need to utilize the information, and then we, not having this information, this data, we need to inform the information into the wisdom to make it better policy effect toward this addressing the COVID-19. So with this, my short brief orientation about the presentation, presenting what is the situation happening in terms of particularly access and participation in this region before COVID and after COVID, and now how we should address this. With this, let me conclude the three key takeaways. One is, even our region, the challenge has been already witnessed before even the pandemic. Second one is, even pandemic has been having great major compounding effect towards, particularly to this region, and then the most affected population group, the marginalized group, which we really need to look at and address. So with the three key messages, once again, thank you, colleague, and then participant, and Ati, back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nini, for that very insightful overview on access and participation indicators. We have our second expert, Ms. Mitsui Uemura, who's the Educational Regional Advisor from UNICEF East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, who will now speak to the issue which frames the discussion on learning loss and education recovery. We've got the macro numbers, and now we're doing a deeper dive into the concept of learning loss and what does it mean for children. Mitsui, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mitsue, Regional Education Advisor here based in Bangkok, looking would support the countries in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. Previously, I was also chief in quite a few countries in this region. Myanmar, before moving to Bangkok for 6 years. I was also chief in Vietnam. I was also chief in Papua New Guinea, and also spent a couple of years also in Africa and also the South Asia and Latin America. I'm really delighted to be part of this panel and really welcome all of you, those who are in person, physically in the room, but also those colleagues who are joining online. I believe this is really a great opportunity. It was only a month ago when the world leaders actually came together at the UN in New York to really participate and really reconfirm their commitment in terms of the transforming the education. And also back in June, those of you who were also participated in the APREMC, Asia Pacific Region Ministers Conference, we also came together and reconfirm our commitment, but also trying to really change the world so that every child, every adolescent can really focus on learning. Wanted to just really make a comment from the previous session where we had two young advocates, two young people who really talked about how important it is to have a inclusive, accommodating society so that they can really fulfill their dream, which is about study and learning. So with that, I would like to start my presentation. So Nini already speak about big numbers, lots of numbers, but really, really important numbers that really highlights in terms of how the education sector was before the COVID pandemic, but also how it is now. Just to pick up on a few figures. So before the onset of the COVID pandemic, we were already in a deep, deep learning crisis. So some of the figures actually estimate that 53% of the children aged 10 years old could not even read and understand a simple story. So it was really that bad. But after the COVID pandemic, we now estimate the number has gone up significantly to 70%. So I think it's really important, alarming figures for us all to remember. Okay, some of the figures that I would like to emphasize, of course, in order to make sure that the child learns, we do need to look at the other elements of the child's rights, but also the children's lives in general. And we know that when we speak about every child learns, we've got to start with younger children. So very concerning figure is that the more than 167 million children who actually lost the first year of learning, which is actually supposed to really lay the foundation, and yet they missed that. So it's really a big concern. In terms of children, the girls especially, the risk of child marriage. Before the pandemic, we were talking about 100 million children, 100 million girls who are really at risk of in terms of a child marriage. Now the figure is even more concerning, 10 additional million girls at the risk of early child marriage. Some of the other figures also in terms of the child labor. Before the COVID, we estimated that 160 million children in terms of engaged in child labor. Now, again, additional 9 million kids who are at the risk of potentially being engaged in child labor. So when we look at the education, when we look at the enabling environment, the children are more and more facing a significant constraints in order to really undertake the learning. Just to coming down to this region, East Asia and the Pacific, again, the global trends in terms of the learning crisis is similar here in this region, but I would like to emphasize, especially the biggest concern in our region, in this region, is the inequities. Those children who have missed the first year of learning, so for the younger children, those children living with disabilities, those children from ethnic minorities, those children who are living in rural, remote areas, those children who don't necessarily speak the language that is official or the language of instruction in the classroom. Those children living in conflict-affected areas and affected by emergencies. Just to really say a few of those disadvantaged children who are even more like facing more challenges when it comes to the learning crisis. Okay, so in this situation, very concerning world, at the same time, the partners, governments, ministries of education, other ministries, together with the partners, organizations, the response has been quite, I think, promising and positive. So the really urgent to make sure to recover the learning that has been lost because of the school closure, because of the lack of alternative education opportunities for those children who needed to stay home, for instance. And also, the many countries actually started to really look at the reforming the education systems. And then, of course, making sure that we are tracking the progress. We needed to first understand where the children's learning levels are, and then also to see what kind of interventions are really important and needed to support children's learning recovery. Sorry, next slide, please. Oops, sorry. Wanted to just to share some of the examples, good initiatives that UNICEF has been working with CMEO and also the ASEAN, as well as the ATCF, KIDE, and then KAIS from Korea, which is looking at the grade 5 students' learning outcome. So back in 2019, this was before COVID, that we did the assessment of the children's learning in reading, writing, as well as mathematics. And now we are supporting those 6 countries, that's Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Philippines, Myanmar, and not Indonesia. Sorry, that's Malaysia. I think Malaysia, I missed Malaysia. And now those 6 countries, and also additionally Timor-Leste, joined the second round of data collection, which is scheduled in 2024. So it's really, really important. This is the first time the regional level initiative in terms of the learning assessment. And it's really extremely important for us to have that baseline. And then we wanted to really see how the children are progressing in terms of learning. Now, in terms of the priorities in this environment, now we very happy to say that the colleagues from the World Bank and then UNESCO, and together with the USAID, FCDO, and then Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have now established this RAPID framework, which is essentially a really framework to guide in terms of the programming for the children's learning. So the RAPID means first R stands for reaching every child and retaining them in school. And then second is assessing their learning levels. And then third, P, prioritizing the foundational, like fundamental teaching and learning. And then increase the catching up, and the remedial education so that the children can be back on track and really accelerate the further acceleration of the further learning. And then development of psychosocial, like well-being. So that's the really first set of actions that the countries are actually already embarking upon together with the support from the other partners. And then the second one is really looking at the system. I wanted to just to say a few words in terms of some of the experiences. So using this framework, as per the framework, already some countries are already really going ahead in terms of supporting education program for the most disadvantaged children. So in case of in Vietnam, girls and boys from ethno-linguistic minority communities, they are already being provided with digital learning opportunities. In Mongolia, radio and television channels in children's mother tongue supported home-based learning during the school closures. In Myanmar, children living in emergency situations have been benefiting from the provision of home-based learning materials. Indonesia, Ministry of Education is already replicating and scaling its early grade reading program, which uses formative assessment, structured support for teachers, and community engagement to address learning barriers for the most marginalized children in one of the poorest provinces, which is Papua. In the Philippines and Cambodia, government and government partners are working to improve strategies for assessing learning among children from ethno-linguistic minority communities. In Cambodia, Ministry of Education has launched a nationwide drive to boost literacy and numeracy in the first 2 years of primary school through comprehensive teacher training that builds on the remote learning system that was put in place during the COVID-19 school closures. In Lao PDR, Ministry of Education is embarking upon the first ever digital learning platform, including the implementation of the teacher development program at scale with a focus on boosting, again, foundational learning in the early grades over primary. When it comes to the digital learning, many countries in this region, but also globally, already started in terms of optimizing the use of the digital devices, digital platforms, to really reach out to those who have been marginalized. So in the case of, in this region, Cambodia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam, Ministry of Education is already working to strengthen the education systems to better support also the children's mental health, safety, well-being. So there's a lot that's been ongoing. And lastly, I wanted to mention that the education is also life-saving and also needs to continue during the emergencies. And it's very, very important, very pertinent to this region. Many countries are actually affected by the climate change, disasters, natural disasters. So in the case of Myanmar, Laos, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Kiribati, they are already working to prepare the emergency, education and emergency preparedness and climate crisis. I think Nini already spoke about the importance of a partnership. Oops. I believe this is my last slide. So in terms of what's next, again, recognizing that there's a lots of already ongoing effort in many, many of the countries, we just needed to capitalize the momentum that's been created and also build upon so that we can scale good practices, we can learn from the experiences, and to really make sure that the government actually have the national plan of action, costed, financed, and try to reach the most marginalized children at all levels of education, starting off with early learning. And then the second one is to look at the broader partnerships and then strengthening multi-sectoral approach. I think as education practitioners, we oftentimes look at our own sector and then see what can be done more. We do need to work with other partners, outside education sector, because oftentimes the solutions can be also found outside the education sector, including education financing. And then the third one is, I think in the previous session, we already witnessed in terms of the power of young people engagement. And then I think it's really important that we meaningfully engage and with the young people to strengthening the national policy using the youth declaration as a springboard from the TESS summit. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation by thanking all of you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitsui. Now we're going to move to our final speaker, Mr. Lars Sondergaard, lead economist at the World Bank, and who's going to speak today. He's going to take the argument of learning recovery and education transformation and broaden it to see how it connects with larger human capital development across the life cycle, and how important and essential it is to recover as well as transform the education system as in response to the pandemic. Lars, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Savadi Krab. My name is Lars Sondergaard, and I have been with the World Bank for 17 years, and I've had the good fortune of getting to be based in Thailand 2 times in my life. This is my second time. I absolutely love living here, and thank you so much for inviting me to share some thoughts on this important topic. In my presentation today, I'll try and do 2 things, building on what the previous 2 speakers have done. First, I'll try and share some evidence to show that the pandemic has devastated current and future stocks of human capital. And then I'll share some thoughts on what policymakers might do to try and address that. Let me start by showing a little visual. So this, I think, broadly probably captures how most of us understand how human capital accumulates during the life cycle. And embedded in this notion is that this graph is steeper somewhere than elsewhere, right? It's very steep in the early years of life, during the young years, and what is so sorry, see if I can get this right. Okay, maybe I'll ask you guys to flip. Can we flip one back? What is so worrying is that all the evidence we have suggests that the trajectory over life has been pushed down. And so as our youth presenters, they said, today's youth are tomorrow's adults. And so these are the trajectory of today's children. In the interest of time, I have material to talk both about the early childhood, school age, and youth, but let me focus just on the first 2, and then perhaps in Q&A, if anyone is interested, I can share what we see on youth. Next slide, please. So on early childhood, as Mitsu already mentioned, school closures compromised pre-primary education even after lockdown ended. Next slide, please. Now, what I think is interesting, sorry, am I? There we go. Now, in countries where the coverage of preschool was high, like in Brazil, what we see is that the biggest losses in preschool coverage happens amongst children from households of low socioeconomic status. Now, in many countries, preschool participation has not returned to the pre-pandemic levels, remaining down by as much as 15% percentage points in Pakistan, 13 percentage points in Brazil and 8 percentage points in Indonesia. The second piece of evidence we have is that children, they faced more stressors, if I may call it that, stressors in their care environment. And with that, I mean the mental health amongst adults caring for young children declined. Where we can measure this, we observe a 26% average increase in the prevalence of anxiety disorders and a similar increase in major depression disorders. Now, declines in mothers' mental health were documented in a number of countries. And for the high-income countries where we have data, child abuse and neglect cases in emergency rooms have increased by up to 97%. What does all of this mean? It means that children's development in these early years of their life slowed down during the lockdowns. Next slide, please. What to do about it? Well, the main goal moving forward is to close deficits so that they don't amplify over time. And given that human capital accumulates over time, doing nothing now to recover these observed declines in child development will lead to slower rates of accumulation as children progress to school and into labor market. So really the most appropriate policy responses depends on both the age of the children but also countries' levels of development. And perhaps here, just allow me to give a few examples. So for children, for infants and toddlers, the very young ones, age 0 to 3, the government's responses could include targeted campaigns for vaccination and nutritional supplements to help fully recover vaccine coverage and nutritional status amongst the youngest. It could involve increased coverage of parental programs seeking to improve the quality of parent-child interactions, including social-emotional support. And for the slightly older children, age 4 to 5, where coverage of preschools varies quite widely across countries. They range from 14% in low-income countries all the way up to 66% in high-income countries. There the message really is to fully reopen preschools and expanding the coverage while maintaining quality. And an important note here, globally, private provision accounts for more than 40% of pre-primary enrollment. And during lockdowns, some providers may have ceased their operations altogether because children stopped coming, and therefore, in the short term, public subsidies may be needed to keep these private providers open. Next slide, please. Turning to school age, which my previous colleagues also focused on, allow me to shed a little bit more light. Nini, you made the strong point that even before COVID-19, the situation wasn't good. Students were losing 1 to 6 years of schooling due to poor quality. Then COVID happened, and in country after country where we have evidence on what has happened to learning, we see roughly the same picture. And the picture is this. The longer you kept schools closed, the more kids they lost in terms of learning. If you want a rule of thumb to think about it, it's for as many months as you kept schools closed, for as many months children lost learning. Or put differently, during school closures, on average, children learned nothing. Now, why is that depressing? Because when you talk about averages and you make a statement that on average children learn anything. You're interested in what does that distribution look like. And again, when we dig deeper in the countries where we have this information, in virtually all the countries where we're able to see this, the children that lost the most were the young children and the children from poorer households. And in this case, I'm showing you the example from Bangladesh, and I'm showing the example from Mexico. And below it says primary, secondary, tertiary. What does that mean? Those are the educational backgrounds of the mothers as a proxy for how wealthy the household is. And as you can see, if you were from a household where the mother had a tertiary education, you'd experience the learning loss. But that learning loss was half of what a child coming from a household where the mother only had a primary education. So again, on average, children learned nothing, but then if the poorest learned more, that meant that during school closure, they forgot stuff that they had learned before the schools they closed. Is it because I'm sitting further away or because my IT skills are worse? I don't know. Am I doing on time? Let me skip this one and ask the question, perhaps provocatively, what's the bigger catastrophe? Is it the COVID-related learning loss, or the fact that so many children are in school but not learning? The numbers that Mitsu referred to before was I'm flipping those numbers around. She mentioned that before COVID, 53% of children did not acquire basic skills, and that has increased to 70%. Well, the flip side of it is that 47% only acquired these ability to read and understand what they read before COVID, and that has now fallen to 30%. Now, think of it this way. In some of the countries, including in this region, the pre-COVID situation was even worse. You mentioned in Laos that the number was only about 2% of their fifth graders are reading at a level that's comparable with global benchmarks. And that may have fallen, right? That's what we're seeing. Every country we've seen they closed down school, it led to a learning loss. But is it that loss and an attempt to try and recover that loss that we should be obsessing about? Or is it the fact that before COVID, very, very little learning took place, full stop? This latter question is sort of at the center of a report that we're working on in the World Bank, and I'm one of the lead authors of it, focusing on East Asia and the Pacific region, where we're asking ourselves what is needed to accelerate learning in this region. And the punchline is we think a much more focus is needed on teachers. The global evidence is very compelling that the most important variable that drives learning is a high quality teacher. It can make a massive difference, as the graph on the left here shows, in a very short period of time. We went out and surveyed officials in ministries of education and ministries of finance across the region. And if you ask, especially ministries of education officials, what do you think is the most important reason for the low levels of learning? The number one reason they answer is poverty, but the second one, by a very long margin, is poor instruction. So what is the evidence on poor instruction? And I'm coming towards the end. Well, I wish we had a lot more information on the quality of teaching, but we do have some. And let me just share two graphs with you here. On the left, it shows what happens when you administer subject content assessments of teachers. In this case, it's fourth grade math teachers in Laos who answering an assessment where the questions are the types of questions that fourth grade math students have to answer. And as you can see, only 8% of the teachers that that answered this test got a passing grade. And similarly, when we work with ministries of education to rigorously observe classroom teaching, what are the pedagogical practices that teachers they use, and systematically try and score what we see across classrooms across the region, we also see very, very few highly effective teachers. This is my final slide, and it's just echoing here what Mitsu said. Together, our three organizations and other development partners have developed a common framework to think about not only learning recovery, but I think more importantly, what is needed to accelerate learning. I would invite you to Google Rapid Framework. It's a fantastic publication with really lots of very good ideas, country examples, illustrating the types of things that might make a big difference. I should also end on my final slide here by saying some of the material that I have been drawing on here is on a forthcoming report by colleagues of mine here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lars. So we've finished the whole spectrum of speakers and issues, and the floor is open for questions. And we will need to manage the questions coming from the room as well as those online. So may I say that please keep your questions very precise, and also tell me to which speaker is it directed to. We'll start with about 3 questions in the room, and then I will go online. So I can see Sheldon's hand.
Well, just one comment first. I think what the last speaker talked about was the idea that you're looking in terms of early childhood, and I'm Sheldon Schaefer. I'm board of directors of the Asia Pacific Regional Network on Early Childhood. We talked about the children during the pandemic who could not go into early childhood programs, but in the longer term, it's the early childhood centers that are not reopening, privately funded or community funded. It's the children who are not re-enrolling because the parents can no longer afford to pay for what is often a fee-based ECD program. And it's the ECD teachers who have left the profession and may not come back. And so the subsector is much more fragile than the primary school one, and I think we have to recognize that. Just a comment on RAPID. I think RAPID is in fact a terribly inadequate framework. If you look through the 77 pages of the Learning Recovery document, there's virtually no mention of early childhood development or pre-primary programs. Learning foundations, not mentioned. Psychosocial well-being, nothing said about the power and the importance of preschool in terms of social emotional learning and all of that. So RAPID, I can understand why it looks attractive, but it's seriously deficient in that one thing. Now to my question, Nini talked about 800 million children who were affected by school closures. Does that include pre-primary children? You talked about 43 million teachers who were affected. Does that include teachers in pre-primary programs? If not, why not? Thank you.
We'll take another 2 questions and then let the panel respond. Is there any other hand going up? Or, yes. Please introduce yourself, and also if you want to direct the question to a specific speaker, please.
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. This is Rashida Chaudhary, representing the National Civil Society Education Coalition in Bangladesh. So wonderful. Paucity of data, lack of data has been one of the factors that we can't even plan and track progress. So my question to the World Bank representative, Mr. Lars, is that do we have any data on public investment in education, particularly pre-COVID and post-COVID, because this is where, the answer lies, because we have seen targeted funding, like stipend for girls, really worked well for bringing in more girls to school in our country. So do you have any data on public funding in education? Because this is going to be one of the answers for countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and even in Latin America. Thank you.
Any other question before I give the space for the speakers to respond? Do I see a hand up? Yes.
I'm from the Philippines. I'm Ched Arsadon. Well, anthropologists have theorized how children from ethnic minority linguistic group learn. And that's why we make curriculum more contextualized. And they are commenting that the early schooling is affecting their transmission of knowledge. And so there are also studies made by anthropologists somewhere in Latin America that children who stayed at home longer, spent more time with their elders, learn more about their indigenous knowledge, indigenous languages. So I hope that we will not frame non-schooling as, in a very deficit manner, but we should also explore how spending more time in the indigenous community, indigenous elders, could have enriched, their knowledge about their identity and about their language. So I hope that we can include that in our research. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions. May I redirect the question of data to Nini on education budgets, Lars, and ethno-linguistic minority education to Mitsui? And if all of you, since RAPID is a UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank approach, if you could also take the opportunity to reflect on Sheldon's comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheldon, for particularly raising the point for this importance of early child education, and also the highlighting the point of this, our response framework need for to be include for the early child education. And also to answer your question, I have to be very blankly and say honestly, and then to conclude that, to my knowledge, it's not included, probably. But I would say that let me defend in the more methodological and technically and make you more confused. Because the one we calculate is the school-going age population. Many of the country, that's a kind of fluid, I would say, definition or, whether to include early child or not. So although, professionally and personally, I thought the issue be reflected, we have an issue in challenging inclusion of this. Because of the data issue, like the colleague from Bangladesh mentioned, Madam said, there's a lack of data is one key challenge. But I think what I would say there, although it may not include it, but I do agree with you that we collectively need to strike to get this information to be reflected. And because, as you mentioned, we all discussed this. This is one of the key important area we should really need to address this. So I hope this answer to you, Sheldon and colleague. Thank you. With this, pass it to you, La.
Thanks. Let me start with the question from the speaker from Bangladesh on public investments. So we have budgets and statements about how countries, they execute their budgets. That's the type of information we have. And we also do jointly surveys of ministries of education. We've done 4 rounds of surveys of ministries of education where one of the questions asks them whether or not they have increased or decreased their resources for education during COVID. Actually, in each round we have asked this question. I was trying to find so I could deliver you the punch messages from that. I couldn't find it, but I think the main message I remember from it is that it's not a pretty picture. In fact, it's a worrying picture of countries during COVID having fiscal pressures from everywhere, from health crisis, from needing to give cash transfers to poor people, and education being squeezed. So a lot of our low income and lower middle income countries in particular are reporting declining education budgets. So not good news. And on pre-primary, I'm fully on board in terms of the need to do more. Perhaps as I presented, I should have done a better job sort of segueing between presenting what we know about what has happened on the early years, and then the policy recommendations, and then indicating that the rapid framework is the joint response on what to do with school-age education, not meant as a, on human development, what are the right things to be doing. It is more narrowly focused on the school age. The report I mentioned at the end of my presentation has a focus on the early years, and so there will be both examples of what countries have done better than others, but also more fleshed out ideas of what countries might want to do in this space. I hope that answers.
Thank you very much for the questions from the colleague from the Philippines. I think especially in this region, we actually have something, first of all, I really acknowledge and then really appreciate the comment. Are we looking at valuing the learning that is to take place outside the formal education system as such? I think even looking at the formal education, I think in many countries, I think in the region, are facing in terms of how to support children of ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, and henceforth, quite a few countries are already supporting the mother tongue-based bilingual education. And it's not necessarily using the mother tongue as a language of instruction per se only, but also reflecting the cultural practices, the local heritage, good practices that has been handed over generations and generations in certain communities are reflected in the school curriculum, textbooks, teaching learning materials, also even setting up the classroom. So I believe the Philippines, we understand that we also have the challenge at the moment right now, but we certainly wanted to support the best learning modality that can really equip children, that can really help children to learn best. And we know that the evidence shows that the mother tongue based bilingual education is actually it seems to be a detour, and yet it's been a shortcut even to help the child to catch up on the national language, starting off with the mother tongue. So I hope that responds to somewhat the question that's been raised. In terms of the rapid framework, I think Lars already explained that this, I think it's probably has taken a bit of a narrow focus, but again, it is really to really make a clear message that we do need to address the learning crisis. And therefore, so weak probably in terms of valuing and then encouraging education practitioners as well as outside people to really look at early learning and also addressing the important issue in terms of mental health, psychosocial support. But I think that's something that we do continue promoting support. Just wanted to mention something on the public financing for education. I think oftentimes we look at how much reduction or how much addition that's been allocated to the education sector. Oftentimes we don't necessarily spend enough time to look at the quality of spending. Are they really, the money has been really utilized, especially to support the most marginalized population in the education sector? So I think there are quite a few countries, again, they're looking at the budget brief, education spending, the public expenditure tracking survey. But I think this is something that as education practitioners, we certainly needed to look at more closely, and also the diversifying probably the education financing, not just looking at the government sector, but also maybe private sector as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitsui. We will go with the questions that have been posed online and shared by my colleague with me. And I will, to the best of my ability, direct them to the right person to be able to respond. But please, colleagues, feel free to come in if it's something. Let's start with the question on teachers, because that's something which Lars highlighted in his presentation. And the question says that equity starts with equity in high quality teacher education, which completely resonates with what you were saying. For this, how can teachers get more access to good training? So I guess I can broaden it to say that what has been the response to teacher education and teacher professional development as a response to the pandemic? I mean, anybody? Lars, thank you.
Maybe, thanks for asking that important question. Maybe just make two observations on teachers. The first is in this region, so the East Asia and Pacific region, where many countries have either had a peak of their student population and are now facing declining student cohorts in the coming years, where countries are relatively close of having net enrollment rates at the primary level close to 100%, and where many, not all, countries have relatively low student-teacher ratios. And fourthly, where very few teachers leave the teacher profession. So take all of those factors together, that demographics is heading down, net enrollment rates are high, student-teacher ratios relatively low, teachers don't leave the profession. For those set of reasons, when you think about wanting to improve the quality of teachers and supporting teachers, in the coming years, let's say in the next 10 years, at the margin, it's going to be more important to think about in-service training or teacher professional development than it will be to think of pre-service training, the new flow of teachers. Right? So that's the first point I wanted to make. And on the second one is, your stock of teachers is a big group of individuals. How do you roll out much more support to, in Malaysia's case, 400,000 primary teachers? What doses of training, what modalities work for teachers in rural areas versus urban areas? That question is really at the heart of the how to do this. And there are good experiences for doing this. I mentioned Malaysia. They've just gone through a major effort in upgrading the English language skills of their teachers, taking an approach where they rigorously assessed teachers' English language skills and used that information to design tailor-made training depending on where teachers were in their skills level. So I think there are good experiences out there to draw from.
Thank you, Lars. I'm afraid I've been told that the time is up, so I have to exercise my moderator's tyrannical privileges to close the panel. So, but for the questions that were posed online, we will respond to them. So we are not ignoring them. I wanted to thank the panelists for giving us this broad overview of the issues. As we delve deeper into the conference, there are going to be lots of issues that we're going to do a deeper dive. But some of the key takeaways are that the pandemic did not create this learning crisis. It existed before it. It only amplified it. And the learning crisis is inherently a crisis of inequity. And we're not talking about competing inequalities. We are talking about intersectional inequalities in terms of approaching it. And we also need to look at early years investment, foundational learning, which is absolutely at the basis of learning. And I think Lars talked about the cumulative nature of, I guess, learning, positive learning outcomes. You could also have the deficit element if you don't get the foundations going. Teachers are extremely important, and they need to be part of our solution. They need to be, in the room, designing the strategies for reaching children and also for their own professional development. So on these notes, let me say thank you for being a very wonderful and engaged audience, and thank you once again to the panelists. Thank Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful and very fruitful session. Especially thank you to Dr. Arti for being the wonderful moderator for this session. Thank you once again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, and now we have already finished for this morning session of today's conference. To prepare for the afternoon session, we will take a break for lunch, and I would like to invite everyone for enjoy the lunch at Delegate 22nd floor, and we will come back again at 1 p.m. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much. Once again, at Delegate Room 22nd floor, and see you again at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.